Thank you. I have never started a presentation without an apology, and I'm not going to start now. So we tested this equipment a little bit before lunch began, and we had a little glitch with a short video that we're going to show at the front end of the presentation. So I know that you will be patient with us as we make sure that the video comes up. In 2013, 19 firefighters died in the Granite Mountain Fire near Yarnell, Arizona. In response to this tragic event, hundreds of Facebook users expressed their grief by sharing Cold Missouri Waters, a 1995 folk song by Canadian singer-songwriter James Keelahan, which told the story of the 1949 Mann Gulch fire through the eyes of crew foreman Wag Dodge. This pairing of past and present events through the eyes, through art, is one of the many ways that public memory appears in response to some particular event or crisis. Although the Mann Gulch fire burned 70 years ago, its place in Montana history has remained vivid for many decades. Our interest as scholars in communication studies focuses on how public memory serves as a collective message about the past, but which is anchored in the present and often helps us move to the future. We think the following video clip helps introduce the topic of Mann Gulch about as well as anything can. We will stop the video at about 5 minutes in, and you're certainly welcome to finish watching the video at your leisure. The whole thing is about 10 minutes, but the first 5 minutes we think is the most important.
This next song we're going to do is the saddest song we do. The one reason it's very sad is because it's true. It's about the Mann Gulch tragedy. It took place on August 5th, 1949. The plane left Missoula, Montana, a load of smoke jumpers. Actually, I think one of them got sick on the airplane and didn't jump. 15 jumped and met one person on the ground. They attacked a small run-of-the-mill fire, which is near Helena, Montana, right along the Missouri River, a place called Mann Gulch. Unexpected to them, the fire blew up. 13 of those firefighters died in the fire. It was a historic occasion for the Forest Service because it was the first time that we'd had such a tragedy. It shook the whole organization to our bones. We reevaluated smoke jumping, firefighting. We started new safety programs, and since then we've tried to have a safe environment to fight fire in the middle of a dangerous business. We've had tragedies since, and we've tried to study each of those tragedies and find out what caused them, for the purpose, of course, that we don't have them again. Jane, why don't you tell us about this song?
The crew chief was a very capable young man named Wag Dodge. He was 33 years old. And when he realized that they could not get out of this fire about to overtake them, he lit a burnout in the grass and tried to get his men to get in that as he created a safety zone. But as you would imagine, they panicked. And they just tried to run up the slope to get away. And of course, the fire caught them. And Wag Dodge actually survived, as well as 2 other of the firefighters. And tragically, though, 4.5, 5 years later, still a young man, he died of a rare blood disease. And so this song is, I like to imagine that he's giving a soul confession on his deathbed, probably before last rites. And he's getting it off his chest, so to speak. Cold Missouri Waters.
I'm stopping it. You can Google this, and if you Google Fiddlin' Foresters, it will come up, and you can finish watching the rest of the song. The song has been performed by a number of different groups, and as I said, the Yarnell survivors' families shared their grief about those deaths, those 19 men, by using this song. It has become almost an anthem for tragedy associated with firefighters. Our presentation is divided into 4 parts. First, we will review the significance and status of the Mann Gulch fire and describe its importance as an environmental, regional, and historical subject. Second, we will describe 4 notable accounts of the Mann Gulch fire that are easily accessible to interested parties and which employ diverse genres. Third, we will discuss the concept of public memory and its impact on shared meaning. Fourth, we will assess the patterns of meaning we see in the Mann Gulch fire as narratives and evaluate the ways the fire can be understood as an iconic event in Montana history. The story of the Mann Gulch fire is one of the most well-known events in 20th century Montana history. The basic events of the fire have been detailed in multiple forms over the decades, and the historic events are well documented. As the video clip points out, on the afternoon of August 5th, 1949, 70 years ago, 15 jumpers met up with a 16th former jumper in Mann Gulch to fight what seemed to be a routine fire. The jumpers landed shortly after 3 p.m., gathered their equipment, and by shortly after 5 p.m., they were ready to fight the fire. By 5:45, the crew foreman, Wag Dodge, realized that conditions had changed and tried to get other crew members to join him in his burnout or escape fire. By 6:15, little more than 30 minutes later, 11 men had died, and 2 others were so severely burned that they died the next day. 13 men died in Mann Gulch, the 13th fire reported in the Helena National Forest for 1949. The tragedy occurred in the space of about 1 square mile. These next 4 slides are visual representations of the fire's progress and are found at the Mann Gulch site. So if you look at this particular one, where you see the flames, you see a little spot, it's tagged, "You are here." So that's the vantage point from which you can view the key events of this fire. The dotted white lines you can see the parachutes at the top where the jumpers landed, and then they went down the hill towards where the flames are, and then they were headed down the South Ridge towards the Missouri River. A few minutes after 5:30, Wag Dodge realized that the fire had jumped across the canyon, so he ordered the men to head back up the slope. You can see Dodge's escape fire to the upper left-hand corner, that small spot above the large fire. And you can see the progress of the large fire headed up the gulch. And then the fire moved very quickly up the slope. There are some estimates that it was moving at 600 feet a minute. And the fire burned over Wag Dodge's burnout, but he was saved because he was lying face down. So you get a sense, I think, from these particular maps or representations of where the fire started and where it was going, very high up in the gulch. Unlike other tragic events in American history, Mann Gulch continues to hold our attention. Norman Maclean explained why near the end of Young Men in Fire. The Mann Gulch fire would never have attained its preeminence in the history of forest fires if Foreman Wag Dodge had not set his escape fire. It made the Mann Gulch fire a lasting mystery story. Unlike larger tragic forest fires that were open and shut affairs, buried forever with one interpretation. With only one interpretation, a forest fire soon becomes a statistic. But the Mann Gulch fire was not only a tragedy, but a mystery story of physical and intellectual dimensions, introducing mistaken identities and explanations accompanied by seemingly unanswerable scientific questions. Why does the story of this fire have such a hold on the public mind of many people even today? We believe Mann Gulch's transformation from an historic event that would normally fade in the public mind over time to its iconic status in recent decades can be understood in the context of three events. First, the Yellowstone fires of 1988 sensitized Westerners, especially those who lived near the park, to the limitations of controlling wildfires and stoked the controversy surrounding how wildfire policy was made and carried out. Second, in 1976, Norman Maclean published his powerful memoir of life in Montana, centered on fly fishing and family, but encompassing larger issues. A River Runs Through It, I am sure we have all read A River Runs Through It, gave Maclean a prophetic voice for many people who wanted to understand Montana, both its natural landscape and its people. This gave him an opportunity both to talk about his next project, a book on the Mann Gulch fire, and to address the challenges of writing its history. Third, the posthumous publication of Young Men in Fire in 1992 generated a large national readership and was followed by the National Book Critics Circle Award. This attention to Maclean was reinforced by the release in October 1992 of the very popular and critically successful Hollywood feature film of A River Runs Through It. Although Maclean had died in 1990, his life, as told through the film and the book, resonated in his abiding effort to find the truth of Mann Gulch in his fire report, as he called his project. While there are many different stories related to the Mann Gulch fire, from official reports to newspaper and magazine accounts, we have identified 4 accounts of the fire to analyze. Each text centered on the story of the Mann Gulch fire. Each text received wide distribution and continues to be publicly and readily accessible for anyone interested in learning more about the fire. In addition, each text represents a different genre and thus may appeal to different audiences. Collectively, they may offer a complete view of the circumstances surrounding the fire. And the 4 texts are, you can read those: Red Skies of Montana, Young Men in Fire, Escape, Fire in Mann Gulch, and A Great Day to Fight a Fire. We'll come back to those. So collectively, we think that those texts offer a complete view of the circumstances surrounding the fire. For instance, in July 2019, an 11-year-old boy visited the Mann Gulch site and was concerned about the lack of upkeep for the crosses marking the locations where each firefighter fell. He returned to his home in Carbon County and went to the library and checked out Red Skies of Montana, Young Men in Fire, and the History Channel documentary Escape. He is currently trying to raise money to maintain the crosses appropriately and will be wearing the names of the 13 fallen Mann Gulch firefighters on the sleeves of his football jersey this fall. Colt Barnard, the young man, has used each of these texts to help him understand the history of the fire, and despite the distance in time between him and the actual event, he's a high school student. He feels an urgency to act and preserve the physical site. As with young Barnard, we do not assume that one text is more accurate than the others because of its genre, and we note that the texts do not appear to be in conflict with each other on important details or significance, but they do offer differing accounts when a closer reading is conducted. We will provide a synopsis of each text according to the chronological order of its public appearance. So we'll start with Red Skies of Montana, which was a feature film released in 1952. It's kind of a lurid ad, but actually very representative of the film. The impetus for this film about firefighting was a 1948 novel by George Stewart called Fire. It appears that planning this film started before Mann Gulch, but as the pre-production work was evolving, scripts changed, actors changed, and the director changed. Probably didn't remain much the same, did it? Except it was always planned for Montana. There's no question that the film moved from an adaptation of the novel Fire to a study of firefighting through the lens of Mann Gulch. Red Skies of Montana was filmed in and around Missoula, including downtown Missoula at the Federal Building, at Hale Field, which now serves as the grounds of Sentinel High School, at Camp Menard in the 9 Mile in Patty Canyon, and at Lolo Hot Springs. The film, directed by Joseph Newman, begins with the return of the sole survivor of a wildfire, the smoke jumper foreman, and his inability to remember how he survived. As the film progresses, the son of one of the jumpers who perished became convinced that the foreman had abandoned his men to save himself. The film ends with another terrible fire, but with the foreman able to convince the jumpers, including the son, to shelter in a burnout, and they all survive. As the Missoulian pointed out, the movie loosely tells the story of the wildfire that, in August 1949, killed 12 smoke jumpers and a wilderness ranger in Mann Gulch. Richard Widmark starred as the smoke jumper foreman who survived the fire, but then was vilified for not saving his men. A very clear parallel to what happened to Wag Dodge. The next text is Norman Maclean's Young Men in Fire, published in 1992 posthumously. There's little doubt that the most significant text examining Mann Gulch came with the publication of Norman Maclean's second book. His first book, A River Runs Through It, was published when Maclean was 70 years old and retired from a long teaching career at the University of Chicago, as well as many years of summer work with the U.S. Forest Service. It achieved critical and popular success. Its popularity prompted discussions of a second book, which Maclean discussed with friends and in public settings. Young Men in Fire narrates Maclean's own quest to understand and tell what happened at Mann Gulch, especially in the context of his attempt to understand how his own survival was similar to, but different from, those who had died in and survived the fire. The third text is what our youngest son refers to as the Conspiracy Channel. I heard a snarky comment about the History Channel earlier today, so I figured it would be okay for us to share family lore. But nonetheless, Escape Fire in Mann Gulch, aired first in 2000, was a 50-minute documentary-style program devoted to the Mann Gulch fire, and which is available for purchase as a DVD. The documentary uses recreation of the fire conditions, as all History Channel documentaries do, recreation, interviews with John Maclean, Norman's son, and other fire scholars and experts, and interpretive material presented by rangers and personnel associated with the Mann Gulch site. Particularly striking is the documentary's attempt to give a sense of the difficulties in running the terrain of the fire. And I was really glad that we were able to get those images from the interpretive panels at the site, because I think that really gives you a very clear sense of what that terrain was like. The fourth and final text that we're using is A Great Day to Fight Fire, Mann Gulch 1949, written by Mark Matthews and published in 2007. Mark Matthews provided a different perspective on the Mann Gulch fire with his 2007 book, inspired in part by the 1998 Helena High School Excel production student project. This is the coolest thing I have ever seen. This student group was asked to assist the Forest Service in preparing materials to support nomination of the Mann Gulch fire site to be placed on the National Registry of Historic Places, and which would commemorate the fire site, and the firefighters, including those who died at the site as well as those who survived. Matthews's book is a self-described nonfiction novel in which he tried to reconstruct the events that led up to and occurred in Mann Gulch, as well as bring to life the memory of those who died that day. In doing so, he not only told the story of Mann Gulch, but incrementally and progressively told the story of a firefighter's work. And we're going to move to a discussion of public memory, which all y'all know a lot about because you are historians and you probably know more about this than we do, but humor us. Public memory, sometimes called collective memory, has emerged in recent years as a major area of inquiry for scholars in various disciplines. At its center is an attempt to understand the ways in which the past is kept alive. For those who participated in the Made in Montana tour of Helena yesterday, you know that everything we heard was collective and public memory. The questions we asked and the stories we were told focused on the role of memory in decision-making and the history of art's place in Helena. For our own discipline, communication scholars Greg Dickinson, Carol Blair, and Brian Ott write that public memory is understood by most, if not all, contemporary scholars as activated by concerns, issues, or anxieties of the present. In sharing public memory, the stories are partial, partisan, and thus frequently contested. And an earlier panel today talked about the fact that maybe it's not so important that we remember exactly what happened. What's important is what dominates the memories. And I think that is essential to understanding this. No single memory contains all that we know or could know about any given event, personality, or issue. Often the selective function of what is recalled, and thus what is forgotten, becomes an issue of concern, and the selective nature of collective memory is often seen as also deflecting other memories. In other words, one memory may result in another memory being forgotten. While we see history and memory as parallel in seeking to explain the past, there is a difference in goals. English scholar Richard Flores notes that memory serves as a means of authenticating a particular vision of the past. History, quite differently, refers to specific norms and values concerning evidence and interpretation. Tamer Catriel studied Israeli heritage museums and discusses two dialectically related views of the past. which she describes as having traditionally been thought of as fundamentally competing views. The first, memory orientation, mythologizes the past. And the second, historical orientation, attempts to put events into context as well as to understand their relationship with contemporary events. Rather than thinking of them as competing views, we might be better off thinking of them as working in partnership. The historical orientation, she claims, builds on and transcends individual memory, while the memory orientation uses and shapes historical knowledge. So what we see becomes part of our memory, and what we remember shapes what we continue to see and eventually alters maybe what we see. Another way to think about this is that memory may force us to examine history, both to expand it and to understand it. Without individual and collective memory of events and people, we would not pay attention to Japanese internment camps, war protests, or the Mann Gulch firefighters. While scholarly approaches to history through research and teaching form an aspect of collective views of the past, there are many other ways people seek to recall the past in formal and meaningful ways. Museums, monuments, parks, historic markers, and memorials are important sites for public memory.
Let's skip this one here.
Okay.
Go to 21.
Okay. In a study of roadside crosses, Holly Everett discusses the choices made in commemoration of site-specific events, and Mann Gulch can be considered a site-specific event. We associate that fire with that place. The choices that she describes that we make in commemorating these sites include obliteration, rectification, designation, and sanctification. Obliteration is the complete eradication of any structure or physical feature related to a tragic incident, such as the decision made to demolish Sandy Hook Elementary School after the mass shooting in Newtown, Connecticut. Rather than keep the school there, it was completely torn down. The site was obliterated. Rectification returns the site to its original condition and might include the kinds of restoration we see related to historic buildings. In a very real sense, Matthews's book, A Great Day to Fight Fire, restores our knowledge of the 13 men who died by filling in their lives and providing information to help us understand their place in the tragedy, as well as their day-to-day lives as firefighters and young men. Designation identifies a particular site as significant, such as naming a site to the National Register of Historic Places, the goal of the Forest Service in initially approaching the Helena High students. And sanctification involves the creation of sacred space by physical manipulation of the landscape, such as the cross is placed on a hillside to mark the locations where firefighters died. Sanctification also has occurred through our collective attention to this event and the people connected to it. Each story of the Mann Gulch fire has a point of view that explores the fundamental question of how people understand nature through the lens of wildfire. The tools of public memory and rhetorical theory help us illuminate important differences in how the story of the fire is presented. We turn to narrative theater. Yeah, narrative theory. There are three assumptions that guide narrative analysis. Think of narrative as a story. We make sense of the world by the stories we tell about it. We are, as humans, storytellers. Narrative is a pervasive form of discourse. This whole conference is about storytelling. And finally, stories are symbolic actions that create social reality. So what we choose to talk about is what we choose to focus on. And the stories we tell draw our attention to the important details of those events. So the elements of the story help us focus on what we think is important. We tell three types of stories. We tell annal stories, chronicle stories, and narrative stories. So an annal is just a chronological order of events as we may think is important. The chronicle has a central subject and a particular coherence. It adds details, it organizes things, it provides a central subject. It tells what happens on a particular day or during a particular week. It does not come to a conclusion. But a narrative has all the characteristics of the annal and the chronicle. It's based on experience, it's a product of memory, it has a sense of chronology, and it defines a central subject. But here's what's important: it adds closure. Narratives often have familiar structures which we can recognize, such as a quest story, a redemption story, a tragedy, and so on. And I'm going to just, these are 6 elements that we can look at in terms of the narrative: theme, structure, characters, peripeteia, or change of fortune, narrative voice, and style. But we want to go to the particular texts. In Red Skies of Montana, let me back up. I want to add a couple of things. In using the analytical elements of narrative to understand these 4 texts and the story they tell, we suggest some specific interpretations. The overarching theme of these texts, individually and collectively, is the question of survival. How did the men survive, the ones that did? And why did some not survive? Why did they survive? Notable peripeteia in this story include the changes in the fire behavior. It shifted direction, and the reasons why Wag Dodge's escape fire was ignored by the firefighters. Were they unable to hear him? Did they not trust him? We would argue that both the terrain, the mountainside, and the fire itself were key characters in the narrative, not just the human actors, but the physical surroundings. Red Skies of Montana is a fictional retelling of Mann Gulch and the tension created when the leader survives and the team members do not. The central characters of the crew leader and the son of the dead firefighter highlight the central theme, which is the question of whether the crew chief was heroic or negligent in his actions. Through great suffering and a literal trial by fire, the crew chief achieves redemption when he saves all of his men during the second fire. In narrative terms, this story has a distinct beginning, which is the first fire, a middle, which is the tension created by the accusations of negligence, and draws a clear conclusion, which is the act of redemption in saving the firefighters during the second fire. The recognizable structure of the story is that of a flawed hero seeking redemption, and the redemption story is one familiar to all of us. We see a lot of redemption stories about sports. In Young Men and Fire, we have another narrative as Maclean tells 2 stories in tandem: his effort to uncover the true details of the Mann Gulch fire and simultaneously to bring meaning to his own life. In this classic hero's quest story, the hero is accompanied by helpers and is seeking an object of great value. The book details Maclean's personal quest for the truth about the events at Mann Gulch, his fire report, but at the same time pursues his quest to understand his own life and give it meaning as he comes closer to mortality. Maclean, however, does not really seem to draw as clear a conclusion as we see in the fictional film, and perhaps that's because we cannot sufficiently fictionalize our lives to have tidy little endings. In Escape, the documentary aired on the History Channel, the narrative is dominated by television's ability to focus on moving images to tell the story. as well as our post hoc understanding of some of the science related to the fire, and you'll see a lot of that discussion. The narrative here is of the morality tale. We have learned lessons from this fire, and we will suffer again if we do not bear those lessons in mind when we encounter a similar situation in the future. And one of the things that John Maclean talks about in this documentary is that exactly the same errors were made in the Colorado fire at Storm King. And then finally, in Matthews's book, A Great Day to Fight Fire, the narrative is really dominated by the chronicle aspects of narrative. The goal is to tell the story of the days and hours leading up to the fire through the biographical details of the entire fire crew and to fill in gaps in our knowledge. In a sense, the narrative is a kind of redemptive story as we come to understand more about the characters, the firefighters who died, as well as the ways in which their families reacted after their deaths. We have known about the fire and its details, but we knew little about the men who died. And Maclean did not talk about those who died, he talked about the survivors. So the Helena High School project helped gather information about the 13 men who died, and Matthews truly fleshed out their lives and gave them a voice. Each story presents a narrative about wildfire that offers a possible closure for the Mann Gulch fire. In each text, the fundamental question or theme concerns survival. People who want to remember Mann Gulch ask how some survived and why others did not. In Western culture, and I don't mean Western US, I mean Western European culture, people are taught that stories have a coherent structure, a clear beginning, a distinct middle, in which certain behaviors and events are identifiable, and which lead to a clear and conclusive end. Within this narrative, we as humans seek a clear cause and effect for all events, to find the pattern of reality and to end with an accurate account of the truth. Western culture tends to reject mystery or fate as an outcome in looking at the world. In a larger context, the story of Mann Gulch and the narratives which form our collective memory of it ask us to examine our views regarding the relationship between humans and nature. Do we believe humans control nature? Do we believe nature dominates humans? Do we believe humans can learn from nature and perhaps manage our own behavior sufficiently to survive? The why and how of Mann Gulch haunts us and drives us, just as it did Maclean. We want a clear cause and effect. We want to tie the story or the narrative neatly together because that's how all good stories are told. Unclear or ambiguous stories mean the story has no ending and thus no closure. We may never know the why of survival, but we ask and we are haunted by the absence of a clear answer. Thank you.